The last couple of lessons that we looked at basically dealt with the heresies and the councils in the early church, and also the development of the biblical canon, as many doctors of the church and local councils helped to compile that volume together. During this time of flourishing for the church's intellectual and spiritual life, Roman society was being helped by the church in many ways, and it was because Rome for a long time was facing a lot of internal struggles, economic and moral and political. It was on its way to basically falling as an empire, and the barbarians on the outside of the empire were constantly attacking and weakening the empire. They were also pagan and in need of Christianization. So during this time, besides the bishops and the theologians, one key group that had developed very early on in the church were the monks and the nuns, the monastic movement. So we're going to take a brief look at the development of the monastic movement in the early church and also their contributions as they continue to evolve and grow and help build the church. Now, monasteries are basically communities of people who are committed to serving Christ. So monks and nuns, they live lives set apart to pray, to fast, and do good for others. Monks are not necessarily ordained to the priesthood. A monk can be a priest. In fact, oftentimes in a monastery, a monk is a priest because they need a priest in order to be able to celebrate the sacraments, especially the Mass. But a monk is basically like a nun, a person who takes a religious vow. They're bound by the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. So they're what we refer to as those in the religious life. They've set their lives apart and are committed full-time to serving Christ. And they're responsible for the spreading of Christianity, for Christian education, for Christian witness, and for prayer and labor and works of mercy. Now, if you look at the early church, there are basically two main types of monasticism that had first developed. The earliest was probably the eremitic, which basically means the hermits who lived solitary lives, usually on the outskirts of society. They weren't completely cut off from the church. They still received the sacraments. They still had a network of charity in which they served one another. Many famous hermits, oftentimes like John the Baptist, lived a life outside of the normal world because they focused their life on prayer. Perhaps they were avoiding persecution, but for the most part it was because they wanted to serve God in a special way. And some of the earliest founders of Hermetic monasticism developed in Egypt. In 4th century Egypt, you had great giants like St. Paul the Hermit, who also knew St. Anthony the Great. Now, St. Anthony the Great, very important desert father here. He actually is called the father of monasticism, even though he wasn't necessarily the first Christian hermit. But many people looked after his example of the life that he led, serving God, fasting in the desert. Also did spiritual battle with many demons, just as Jesus was tempted in the desert, but known for his holy way of life. In fact, St. Athanasius, when he escaped some of the persecutions in the early church, when emperors were trying to drive him out, he often would run to different places, and in one case he actually stayed with St. Anthony the Great and wrote one of the first biographies of a saint, St. Athanasius' biography of St. Anthony the Great. So many of the followers of St. Anthony were known as desert fathers and mothers. The next type, which came later, was the cenobitic, which is basically monks and nuns who live in community together in one location. So monasteries and communities, the founders of those also trace back to Egypt. You had the rule of St. Basil the Great. The rule is basically guidelines and precepts to govern how they are to live together in community. But probably the most famous rule was written in the West, and that's the rule of St. Benedict of Nursia. And he was a founder of a monastery called Monte Cassino. And even though it's undergone various destructions and reconstructions throughout the ages, it actually still exists to this day. So even though monks were around since definitely the 3rd century, this father of Western monasticism, St. Benedict, he was born in 480 AD. He's the founder of the Benedictine order, and he composed the rule, which we call the Rule of St. Benedict, to guide the daily activities of his monks that stayed with him. And basically he divided the daily activities of his monks into prayer and work, and this became known as their motto. The motto of the Benedictines to this day is Ora et Labora, which means pray and work. The daily prayer that they recite is the Divine Office, the Liturgy of the Hours. They usually chant that together at 7 specific hours of the day and night, and they have the daily sacrifice of the Mass. Even their labor was actually considered a form of prayer, and it was usually always manual, farming, building, but also it was intellectual. It involved the copying of manuscripts, writing books, education, and the like. When the Roman Empire was not doing too well and things were not so great for citizens, the monks actually did their fair share of work to try to help people, especially the poor, but also they preserved the intellectual life of the classic world. If it weren't for the monks in their monasteries copying down and translating manuscripts, including the Bible, we would not have many of the great classics of Latin and Greek literature. All of those were preserved by the church because the church valued learning. And eventually many of those monasteries actually became the first schools. Later on during the Empire of Charlemagne, they became the foundation for what would later develop into the first colleges and universities. Just for an example here, look at this right here. Now, the scriptures were originally written in a way that there were no punctuation or spaces in between the words, so everything was written all compressed together because they didn't have spaces back then for words in some ancient languages. So, line right here, what does it say? God is nowhere, or it could say, God is now here. Two complete opposite meanings, but see how, like, the challenge that you had to work in maybe a cold room during the winter with open windows by some lantern light and be very good and accurate at translating languages and write for hours on end trying to transcribe as best you could the scripture so that you didn't make any kind of mistakes because you didn't want to mess up the meaning of it. And as time passed, the monasteries were not only centers of learning but also missionary activities. And the monks spread the Catholic faith. And among some of these missionaries, you had St. Boniface, a Benedictine monk from England. In the 8th century, he left England for the area of Germany, and for many years he preached there, and he spread the faith, and he baptized many people from Germanic tribes. So there was St. Gregory the Great, a Roman politician who became a monk and then pope, and he saved Rome's poor from barbarian starvation and ruin in the 6th century. Basically, the Christianization of many of these barbarian tribes that were invading Rome at the time. The monks are responsible for helping civilize them and bringing learning to them, preaching the gospel and baptizing them, and many of the barbarians settled down and became organized into cities, towns, and villages and developed crafts and schools. The monks were responsible for helping Europe to develop civilized centers during that so-called period of the Dark Ages. The only reason why the Dark Ages were dark were not because of the church. The church was actually the light in the darkness. They were actually helping people after the fall of the Roman Empire to maintain some kind of stability, some kind of order. So we have the monks to thank for building the kingdom of God and also keeping basically a decent way of life for people, and also serving and praying. And many of them still do that today for us. We have the Benedictines, the Cistercians, the Trappists, the Carthusians. They're all basically different types of orders which dedicate themselves to the service of God and the love of neighbor.